Hello, friends. Welcome back to episode 7 of the Manitou Lockdown Bible Study on Philippians, where we read through the letter that Paul wrote to the Christian church in Philippi while he was locked down in under house arrest. It's 4 chapters long. We have come to the middle of the second chapter. We just finished reading what is known as the Christ hymn, which are verses 5 through 11, which was thought to be almost universally a common Christian hymn of the early church that Paul was using in his letters. It is profound theological song, and there's a lot of implications and invitations in it. So if you get a chance to listen to the last Bible study, I encourage you to do so and read that passage. Also, I put out a challenge. If anyone wanted to compose a song that used those letters, then I'd be really interested to hear that. So now we come to the next part of the letter, in which Paul follows up the Christ hymn. This is chapter 2, verses 12 through 18, and I'll read these verses. And once again, invite you to listen the first time specifically for just what do you notice? What word or phrase sticks out to you? What's something? You don't have to know why. You don't have to have a big theological inspiration from it. Just what do you notice? And then the second time I'll read it through, and I'll invite you to consider what do you wonder? Is there a question that comes up? It could be related to what you noticed, or it could be related to something else. So I'll read it slowly and invite you to listen slowly, and hopefully we'll meet at the same place at the end. Okay, here we go. Philippians chapter 2, verses 12 through 18. Listen now to the word of the Lord. Therefore, my beloved, just as you have always obeyed me, not only in my presence, but much more now in my absence, work out your own salvation with fear and trembling. For it is God who is at work in you, enabling you both to will and to work for God's good pleasure. Do all things without murmuring and arguing, so that you may be blameless and innocent, children of God without blemish in the midst of a crooked and perverse generation, in which you shine like stars in the world. It is by your holding fast to the word of life that I can boast on the day of Christ that I did not run in vain or labor in vain. But even if I am being poured out as a libation over the sacrifice and the offering of your faith, I'm glad and rejoice with all of you. And in the same way, you also must be glad and rejoice with me. So what did you notice? What did you hear? What word or phrase stuck out to you? I invite you to just say that where you are. Write it down maybe if you have a journal. Type it in here as a comment section. And then now I'm going to read it again. I invite you to listen once again. This time, what do you wonder? Therefore, my beloved, just as you have always obeyed me, not only in my presence, but much more now in my absence, work out your own salvation with fear and trembling. For it is God who is at work in you, enabling you both to will and to work for God's good pleasure. Do all things without murmuring or arguing, so that you may be blameless and innocent, children of God without blemish in the midst of a crooked and perverse generation in which you shine like the stars in the world. It is by your holding fast to the word of life that I can boast on the day of Christ that I did not run in vain or labor in vain. But even if I am being poured out as a libation over the sacrifice and the offering of your faith, I'm glad and rejoice with all of you. And in the same way, you also must be glad and rejoice with me. This is the word of the Lord. So was there anything in that second reading that caused you to wonder, piqued your curiosity? So I invite you to write that question in. And while you're thinking, I will I'll offer a few thoughts from the passage some things I noticed. The first is this word therefore. I heard someone say a long time ago, when you come across the word therefore, find out what it's there for. I know I am not the first preacher to use that, so forgive me. So what is it there for? This conjunction connects the previous elements with the future, and what this little hinge does here is it connects with the Christ hymn. So Paul is saying, hey, because we look at what God did, leaving deity form to come down and live in human form, and not just human form, but to be found as a servant in a human form, and not just that, but to die as a human, and not just to die as a human, but die in the most horrific and shameful way down the cross. Therefore, since God has done that for us, then here is a way for us to live with one another. In light of this revelation we've had from God about how God works, we thought God worked like Zeus and all these others who were powerful and abused humans and all that sort of stuff. But no, this is how God works. So therefore, in light of this, here are some ways that we can then live. So that's the first thing I notice, is the therefore. The second thing is this phrase, work out your faith, work out your own salvation with fear and trembling. I've liked this verse for a long time. The piece I like about it is this invitation to work out your salvation. I grew up in a church, and I think a lot of people did, where I got the impression sometimes that I was supposed to just believe. You just believe and everything will be okay. Fortunately, I had a number of Sunday school teachers and youth ministers who encouraged me to ask questions, and so I did. And instead of feeling guilty for doubting, I was encouraged in it. Because when we ask questions, when we work things out, we get to a deeper place. It's a little bit like digging. It's in some ways more an act of faith to doubt than to not, if that makes any sense. So here Paul is saying, work out your salvation with fear and trembling. Now, what's additionally interesting, is the you or the your here. We read it as singular, typically. Like, hey, I need to go off and work out my salvation by myself in the closet, whatever. It's not singular. Remember, Paul's writing to a whole group of people. It's plural. So Paul is inviting them to work out their collective salvation, their salvation as a community. Work it out with fear and trembling. How does that change things? How does it change things if I'm not just trying to get myself saved, but I'm trying to get the whole community saved? It's not just me, but it's my whole family. If it's not just my family, but my neighbors as well, and not just my neighbors, but the whole neighborhood and the whole city. What if we're all tied in this together? What if our salvation in some ways is connected with one another? How could you ever imagine any such kind of situation? It would just be too mind-boggling to imagine that our health, which is a way of describing salvation, that our very lives depended upon working it out with one another. I mean, I can't imagine. So, but maybe there'll be a time in which something will happen that will help us imagine this being the case. Paul is in some ways inviting the Philippian church, saying, hey, you as a community, your existence, your salvation, in some ways gets dependent upon one another. Now, there might be some pushback on this, like, no. Fine, great, I love that. But But here's another little piece of evidence in that direction. This phrase, fear and trembling. It's used. Kierkegaard uses the phrase. It's a popular poetic term here to work out your faith. The fear and trembling. It's possible Paul made this up. He does use it two other places in two other letters, in 1 Corinthians and 2 Corinthians. The way I used to read this was to work out your faith with fear and trembling, which would be like Moses standing before God with his knees shaking, or Isaiah falling down before God, fear and trembling. It could, I think that's maybe part of it, but the other times that Paul uses the phrase fear and trembling, it has to do with how he greets one another. Greet one another with fear and trembling. I greet you with fear and trembling. How does that change things? How does it change things if we're invited to encounter one another with this kind of fear and trembling? Not necessarily in the sense that I'm afraid you're going to hurt me or I'm anxious around you, but more of this sense of how I might encounter Mount Rainier, or an 8-foot wave at the beach, or this gargantuan redwood tree that's right next to the church. Like, hey, this is awesome. It is, to encounter it with fear and trembling. How might that change things if that's how we encountered one another? So Paul could be saying you're going to work out your salvation with fear and trembling, which is as you meet one another, as you encounter one another, treat one another with this kind of respect and awe and wonder, then that is a way of responding to this Christ hymn about how God has treated us. Okay, so one other thing I want to say before, I want to make sure this doesn't go longer than 15 minutes, is Paul then goes on to say, do all these things without murmuring and arguing. This is, you kind of skip over this, but pause on it for a second. How do things get worked out in community? Because community, there's going to be conflict. If you've been a part of a family or a church, you know that conflict exists. So Paul's saying, how are you going to work this out in the community? And here he gives these two things: without murmuring or arguing. I think these are the two poles of how we tend to work things out. Murmuring is the passive aggressive way, which is, I'm frustrated with something. I'm not going to say anything to you, but I'm going to mumble about it when I go off away. I can't believe the pastor did that, or da-da-da-da. Not saying anything to him, but I'm going to mumble or murmur about it. The other way is the aggressive way, is to say, oh, all right, you didn't do something I like, let's go. It is a legitimate trying to just get your back up and just let's go at it. That happens less often in churches, but it does happen. Certainly happens more in families. Paul's saying don't work it out in either one of those ways. Instead, we might work it out in the way that Jesus talks about in the Sermon on the Mount, or not in the Sermon on the Mount, but in Matthew, to if you have a problem with your brother or sister, go to them and talk to them about it, express it. Use an I statement. It's not used here, but go directly to the person instead of murmuring about it passive aggressively, or going at them as if they are they're an enemy in the ring. So, therefore, because of the Christ hymn, we are invited to work out our collective salvation with fear and trembling. As we do this with one another, don't do it without mumbling, murmuring, or with arguing. There's more in this passage, of course. I've already said enough. I will point out one last thing, is that it ends with rejoicing. Paul says, even if I've done this in vain, I'll rejoice, and I invite you to as well. And this is a key theme of the book of Philippians, is joy, which, as we come up on the Easter Sunday celebration, one of the things I heard from the elders in our church was, we want to be joyful. We want it to be joyful. So that is where God is showing up. Pierre Desjardins said that joy is the infallible sign of the presence of God. And so I do hope and pray that your day is full of joy, and that we're able to walk through Good Friday into the joy of the Easter celebration together. So till we meet again, may you be cautious and kind and courageous.